Thank you very much, Laurie. Before starting, maybe you can help me understanding whom I'm talking to. And who of you already works on biomass? Just raise your hand. Okay, wow, good. And who of you is interested in the bioeconomy? Good. And who of you does think positively about the bioeconomy? Okay, not so many. Excellent, very good. And then I used the right slides. So just to tell you, I'm a physicist by training, an experimental physicist, and I'm working since about 20 years on sustainable biomass and land use. And I will share you some experiences and thoughts and the way forward, hopefully. We have developed not only in my institute, but with IEA Bioenergy and another organization called GBEP. I will come to that. So I think these little symbols representing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, they are hopefully known to all of you. If not, read about it. But the important thing, I guess, a lot of people forget, all countries on this planet are developing in terms of the SDGs. There's not one single country who is already there. So we are all developing. And we should forget the so-called divide between the global south and the global north, or the global east and the west, and the industrialized countries and the developing countries, because basically the message from September 2015 in New York, when the SDGs were kind of agreed upon, was there is no business as usual anymore. Having that in mind, we should also note that the SDGs themselves and the respective targets and indicators are, at least for the discussion around the bioeconomy, are just a framework. They are not good enough already, but they hopefully help us to understand the challenges and improve a little bit. You already heard biomass, and especially the carbon in the biomass, is something we should consider. So we call it the stuff of life. It's also the stuff of death, because it's a life cycle, not with a dead end, but with a circularity. So when you see, it doesn't matter if you're part of agriculture, forestry, if you're part of waste management of the food system, pulp, paper, furniture, and even nowadays the medical application become an additional component to that, and there's a whole bunch of services being associated with biomass and its application in modern societies. And then there is something where the whole thing started, the energy sector. You may say a couple of 100,000 years we started with the energy sector because we felt cold and it was dark outside, and we started lighting a fire. And from that time onwards, this has developed, and it has been forgotten because other fires, other sources have become more important. But nowadays, we may come back similarly to the agricultural practices such as agroforestry we heard before. But importantly, there's not one sector dominating. You can have an economic view to the flows between the sectors. You can have a mass-based view between the sectors. You can have an energy-based view and so forth. And depending on that view, there will be more relevant than with the other view. But basically, the structure, the biophysical reality behind it is something that there is not a dominant driver. It's a network, a complex network of activities. And you may see that there's fishing is actually not included, because in that, where that came from a project where we looked to terrestrial biomass, and that is a truncation, a narrowing of the focus, which in the longer term is not valid. So we should actually include the marine sources, the aquatic biomass, and its interaction with land along the coastal lines even more. And now there is a term you may find increasingly in the literature, which is called blue bioeconomy. And that is something which hopefully reflects that water is not just a substance, but a substrate where a lot of life and a lot of biomass can be found. Now, linking the two, Sustainable Development Goals and biomass, that is something we have published already a couple of years ago, and what we know is there is an intrinsic connectedness between the SDGs and biomass. As you see here, just an indication, there is a publication you can download for details. On the other hand, biomass, and especially bioeconomy or biofuels or bioenergy or biomaterials, is not mentioned at all in any of the texts related to the SDGs. But the same is true for fossil fuels, and the same is true for nuclear energy and so forth. So be aware, that's why I'm saying the SDGs are a framework. They don't immediately give you direction, guidance towards the bioeconomy. This is something we have to construct. And the other thing, we heard from Laurie about the potential scarcity of carbon when we separate between biogenic carbon, the kind of short life cycles, and the long-term cycles, which is basically fossil and geogenic, like when you have cement or something. And this is just one view of the global system. On the left hand, you see all biomass which is appropriated by humans. There's more biomass than that, but that is what we take out of nature. And that includes other way around. The food and feed, which is dominating in terms of energy equivalence. Then we have the feed for the animals, that's also energy. Then we have wood as a material and wood as energy. And within that, we also included some of the straw and manure and so forth we have. And down there is all the fibers we use, other than wood. And that gives you something like 180 to 190 exajoules. If you compare that to the global energy system we have, which excludes food, feed, and fiber, that's just the energy term, the traditional exajoules, you will see that we are approaching something like 550, 600, and dominated by non-renewable fuels. These are the fossil ones, and down there we have all of nuclear converted, all the non-biomass renewables, and that is biomass used for energy. So you see, there's a little bit more because we cycle some of the residues generated here into energy, which is then a double counting, if you may say so. But this comparison should just tell you, if we defossilize, maybe that's a more appropriate term than decarbonize, and would just take biomass and would leave the demand supply logics the same, we would have to more than double our current appropriation of the biomass on the planet. That may cause trouble. And the other thing is, it's not the only way to cycle carbon. There are other options to do so. And in the afternoon later, you will hear something about hydrogen. Part of the work in our group is to look into carbon capture and use. I wouldn't call it recycling, it's use. But you have to also be careful to say that's not possibly open up a new avenue to actually maintain that. So I think the defossilization of the global energy system is something we have to do, but with what we replace it is an issue we should discuss. And clearly we have to discuss, do we actually need all that? And who needs all that? But I will not go into that today. When we then talk about the uses of the biomass, it becomes messy. To adding up tons or joules, that's fine. That's what we can do. It's an easy metric. But if we see that we even have a discussion about the potentials, because between biomass cultivation, that's what's happening on the land, and the residues we get from that cultivation, and it also, again, in the sense of the blue bioeconomy, it also comes from oceans and coastal areas. And then we have other things we may want to do on that land, and they are actually conflicting with each other. The same on the demand side. You may say, oh, we want to eat more and better and have animals raised better than they are now. That's land intense. We may have also raw materials to process into all kinds of stuff we need. And we have heat and power and motorized transport. Doesn't matter if it's terrestrial or flying or shipping. And then we have goals in one case, but also constraints that we want to mitigate climate change. We want to have security of supply. We want to have employment. We want to have a reasonable amount of money we spend for all that. And we want to conserve at least some part of nature. To what extent, that's up to discussion, but at least these goals are formulated. And they're all interacting. So what we heard already, there are trade-offs between that one, that one, that one, that one, and so forth, and there's a multidimensional problem. And typically, people who do analysis say, oh, let's just simplify the system. So you take that as a constant or an exogenous kind of variable, and you just look on some parts of that, like you may want to look into the biogenic residues and wastes, and so forth. But actually, by that decision, you already rule out a lot of potential interesting things. And that's why our recommendation, and what we are trying to do nowadays, is to say, be aware of the trade-offs, okay, but go for the positive ones. That's what is also known as synergies. And be aware that our current think tools, the integrated assessment models we use on the global scale, and a lot of the agricultural and forest models and land use models and so forth, are actually not able, by their very construction, to do that. That's why we have a dedicated work stream to look into exactly that and talk with the modelers. Couldn't they improve? Couldn't there be more of a family type of approach with different views on the world and different capabilities and so forth, but getting a better outcome? That's what we urgently need. The other thing is you're going to have a prospective view, something, how could the future look like? And if we come to the bioeconomy, that means we are not talking just about energy. Last week, the World Energy Outlook has been released by the IEA, our mother in Paris. And the interesting news from that is there is a sustainable development scenario embedded in the World Energy Outlook, and it assumes that some of the priorities we're talking about, food first, sustainable land use, bringing degraded land back into production and so forth, what we have under the SDGs are actually being implemented. And under that condition, the world isn't looking that bad, but if you don't, then you're in trouble. And what we're trying to do here is to say, when we look to the potential demand for biomass and the potential supply, we clearly have a discussion, how exactly is it? And again, this is now billion-ton tri-matter, because we don't want to talk just about the energy case, so we converted the energy use into tons. And then you see, oops, this is a little bit gone away, but then you see that in this case, we can get actually from the demand side, we have some of the uses for biomass, which can be substituted with other options. So it's not that the bioeconomy is an exclusive answer. It's answering some, it has some development opportunities which are interesting, but it's not good enough to deliver on the SDGs. It's not even good enough to deliver on SDG 13, which is climate change mitigation. So in that sense, you must be inclusive, and there are other land uses and other demand drivers which can influence the outcome possibly better than having more biomass. And one of the things in that sense is electrification. If the electricity system is renewable and the renewables are in compliance with our demands, for example, for nature protection, water use and so forth, then the electricity can drive a lot of uses which are currently under the bio-based approach. They can drive them out. That means a complete change of system that won't happen overnight, but it's a possibility we should acknowledge. Now, talking about sustainability is a bit tricky. It's not good enough to just have the 13 SDGs. You want to operationalize what's behind that. And people have started doing so. Many have done that. on the international level, on the regional level, and on the national level, and in some cases it's even subnational and supply side kind of approaches. And what this just should show you, there is a huge variety of players. There's also the issue of scales, from the international to the regional to the national to the subnational, and then you have the sectoral logic that the people talking about financing and the people talking about biofuels and those talking about forest or the ones talking about the broader environment, and there's also the social debate behind it and the economic debate, they don't talk much to each other. So what we actually should do is to harmonize these kind of requirements across sectors. Because more and more, it doesn't matter if you're booked in your activity here or there or there or even there. It is something where you hopefully have a better, more integrated approach to your activities. We have done from 2008 to 2011 within a group called the Global Bioenergy Partnership, which is, I don't go into any details, it's an intergovernmental partnership which was founded in 2005 at a G7, at that time at a G8 summit, the Glen Eagle summit in the UK. And there are 3 pillars for sustainability indicators which have been developed jointly in this group, and they are applied now. I will come to that. And though these 24 indicators is a political compromise which was done before the SDGs were introduced. And in the moment we see that there is a discussion how we can improve on some of the interpretation of those 24 in the light of the SDGs. So it's not the story isn't finished. And we have had the pleasure to work 2 times already together with some colleagues in implementing these indicators in Germany. And we have actually done it for the 2nd time now. It's just being published. And the interesting thing here is when you take these 3 pillars and you don't want to go immediately into quantification, most of them are quantified, and we have a time series from 2010 to 2018, so you can see the dynamic. But that doesn't give you the right and the only signal, because the direction of these little arrows here tell you what is the trend over time. So lots of them are stable. Some of them are going down, others are going up. And the color code behind it tells you something about, are we approaching what we want? Or is it, we don't know, then it's a yellow, like here. And we have one case where it's even red, and that is biodiversity. The biodiversity targets in Germany related to the bioenergy are not met. We are not on track at all. And that's not just for the bioenergy, that's also for other drivers of land use, but it's, anyway, it's something. So you can summarize a rather complex picture of about these indicators. There are some sub-indicators, so we're talking about 100 different orienters for your knowledge. Most of them are okay, but there are some where even under the conditions of Germany, they are not really good. I mentioned that we're talking about how the SDGs are related to the GBEP sustainability indicators, the GSIs. And in the moment, we are looking into not only these linkages, but to what extent can we actually use the implementation phase of the SDGs to make a better qualitative and process-wise approach also to the sustainability of the bioenergy. And in parallel, we talk about an extension of the GBEP indicators and the work of the GBEP to the bioeconomy under the heading bioenergy within the broader bioeconomy. And under that heading, we started to broaden the discussion. We had a workshop in end of May this year in Utrecht, where we would like to continue, and actually we do, to improve our common understanding and allow mutual learning. So because we're not saying the bioenergy folks or the biomaterial folks or the food and feed people or the forest people or the hunters and gatherers or the fishery, they know how it is. No, none of us knows. We have to work collectively on that, collaboratively, to improve our understanding, which we haven't yet gained. Also, there are good practices, examples for people are actually doing this kind of thing. It's just reminding me I should stop in a few minutes. And to align, other way around, to align some of these approaches, which I mentioned, the various approaches on the various scales, and to bring them into something like a joint activity. That is published, you can read the details, it's something I think worthwhile to take a look at if you are interested in that. That is a graphical representation of what we're actually doing. So we have a cloud of the governance of the bioenergy within the broader bioeconomy, where IEA Bioenergy, especially where I work, but also the GBEP and many others are actually part of this discussion, and we still have a lack regarding some of the UN agencies and especially of the financing sector to be included in that. So what we identified in Utrecht and are now starting to implement is to say we should operationalize this governance of land and biomass use, so taking the SDGs as a normative framework, but translating that into something applicable. And if it's applicable, that means it cannot be 300 indicators. It must be a subset, what we call the core set. And for that we run a project which has started a few weeks ago. The other thing we learned that creating trust is really, really core to all these approaches. So unless we achieve an approach which allows us to listen and learn and even criticize in a productive way, we won't go far. That is something we really learned. We have published a 3-year research project where this was one of the major findings, that there is a lack of mechanisms and approaches and attitudes to create trust between the various players. So that's something we have to do. And part of that is to look into the international collaboration, and especially regarding the financing institutions. I won't talk much about that. I quickly skip over the last the next 3 slides. One of the questions always is who actually governs? You know, who is making decisions? And we know there is the UN, they make decisions, but they may not have much meaning. There is the G8 or G7 or the G20, OECD, and others, regional bodies and so forth. And then there are lots of governments, but there are also other players, the NGOs of this world, the private sector and its organizations and so forth. I'm not going into that detail. Just that you know what our role at the IEA Bioenergy is in that game. We collect really a lot of countries, and they are part of our discussion, so we don't have to write a paper, publish it, and hope that some politicians may read it. We're actually talking to the governmental people because they're paying us. So that's one of the options we have to create to make a trusted kind of avenue into the discussion. I will skip that for your own. We have published it a couple of times. If you want to create trust, you also must be transparent what you're aiming at. And what we are trying to do is to say we would like to have a sustainable food system, a sustainable biomaterial system, and a sustainable bioenergy system that includes a lot of other energy, which is a lot of other renewables, which is not biomass. But in the bioeconomy debate, that should be acknowledged. And biorefineries, you will hear more about that. Not just crude, large refineries, also small, smart options we have may bridge between these different, I wouldn't call it sectors, but streams. And before going too much into details, I'm happy to talk about details as well. But just to say, that is an UNECE, a United Nations Economic Commission for Europe debate, which includes a lot of countries outside of the UNECE already. But next to us, and I mentioned this earlier in a question, there is a continent, Africa, where we often just see, oh, this is a place I don't want to go, other than for touristic reasons. And the lost continent, it was entitled a couple of times. But nowadays people start to realize it's actually something we may want, not as a new paradise, but as a new place to actually look to and work with. And one thing is exactly that. That is the Great Green Wall initiative. And actually it's not a wall, it's not a Trump thing, yeah? It's coming from a historic debate. And there are people in this area are actually trying to do a lot of things we would like to see in a sustainable development logic with biomass, with land use practices. And they don't get payment from a carbon tax collected somewhere. They don't get funding from the international development banks and so forth. The only funding they get is from the GEF, from the Global Environment Facility, for some of their collaboration. But for the actual doing on the land, they're doing it on their own. It was a bottom-up activity from farmers and people living in small villages, and they felt threatened. And that is something which is a large driver which you typically don't see in economic optimization models. So they are actually doing things to maintain their living and to improve the opportunities that their kids and the kids of their kids would actually be able to sustain a living in these harsh areas. And Nelson Mandela, some of you may remember him, a great man, white-haired, old, but not a white one. He said, "This always seems impossible until it's done." And I think that's something we should take by heart. And the next one is even more important in my view. An African proverb, if you want to go fast, then better go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And I think that's something, hopefully within the bioeconomy and the governance of sustainability of the bioeconomy, in the context of the broader systems on this planet, we should better do. The sectoral thinking and the kind of governance along lines and the knowledge production along certain journals and articles and schools, that's hopefully is the past. So I invite you to do a more collaborative kind of thing, and that's what we need to deliver on our ambition. If you want to read more, if you want to contact me, that's where you can get the information. And with that, I thank you for your interest.
There is a lot of time for it anyway, so don't be shy. Who wants to start and has a question for Uwe? Actually, that's not very smart because then Uwe doesn't have a mic.
Okay, thank you. Hello. Jean from ELSA, Environmental Life Cycle Assessment. What is your definition of bioeconomy? Because we have a lot of information, but what is the definition for you of bioeconomy? Just to start.
Well, it was actually my first slide when saying biomass is the stuff of life. So the bioeconomy is everything you do with biomass. That's my definition. There are other definitions from the OECD, from the European Commission, from colleagues in Malaysia and in Brazil and the US and so forth. But as a physicist, I would say go to the most basic definition, and that is all biomass flows, either being appropriated by humans or being influenced by humans. That would be my definition of the bioeconomy, but that's my personal one. So in the IEA Bioenergy, we don't have a definition as a kind of separation compared to others. We kind of embrace all. That's our explicit thing, to not say, oh no, that's not wrong. We focus on a few more practical definitions, so like the medical applications we leave out and the services we leave out in the moment. It's still too early. We may be wrong in 10 years, but that's what we do. But so we have a rather practical along the flows of tons and joules. That's what we do basically in our definition.
Li Shen from Utrecht. I have a question about the governance. And you showed, first you showed us the vision of governance, a top-down approach from UN, from OECD, from IEA, to manage a sustainable biomass supply. And one of your last slides, very inspiring, just you showed the picture of Africa. It's totally nothing to do with all this top-down governance. Would you share with us your vision? How can we go there? Should we stick to a bottom-up, which go to more practical, local, or actually we should make more effort from top-down?
You're referring to that one, right?
Yeah, you had another sheet on all the
all the actors. The map of the actors. Let's see. This one.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I use the cloud is to say, get rid of this logic of top-down. That's, in the best case, it's 20th century. In the worst case, it's 17th century thinking. Nowadays, we have to collaborate across sectors, across scales. And the confusion which I tried to mention with the cloud picture here is to say each of these individual actors on the different scales, from the international to the regional to the national and to the subnational and supplies, I didn't put that into even, that's not only creating noise, right? That's kind of a disorientation. It's also increasing barriers. And that's exactly the opposite of what we have to do. And that's why we need not necessarily a harmonization, but an alignment to make this kind of more permeable and focus on some of the things. And that's not an activity where a UN agency may lead and then we say, they made a decision in New York and now we apply it. No, that's not the way it works. And nowadays, governance is something we are actually inventing. Hopefully, you are part of this. That you're saying, now the way I'm used with my colleagues and the agency you have to influence is something you put into the governance game. And then you reflect on it. But I cannot give you the recipe. Even if I'm leading a work stream on governance, I can tell you that everything I have written, in my humble understanding, on what science tells you about governance is bullshit. We are not there to have the adequate governance of the SDGs. Deliver as one. That is what they want. Not to take one goal or the other goal or the third one, all of them, and put that into practices. And you will see a publication which is actually on our server already. So if you go to our IINAS server, you see it under the news section, where we looked into the implementation of the SDGs in Latin America and try to understand what they're doing. And the interesting thing is they have embraced in Latin America the bioeconomy as one of the vehicles and mechanisms to deliver from their point of view on how they achieve the SDGs. If you take the European examples, and we have plenty of them, not even one actually proposes this integrative approach. There is conceptual papers, but in the strategies where the governments have, it's not appearing. So that's why we should learn from each other. We can actually learn from some part, and that is the first step of the governance. Then we hopefully improve on delivering on that. But that's something we still have to do. We don't have the systems in place to adequately govern the bioeconomy. That's, take it for granted if I say it just as such.
Thank you for your presentation, Frédéric Bernard from Toulouse-White Biotechnologies. I agree with you, it would be great if you could collaborate more, but it's difficult to do in practice. And I worked on standardization on biofuels at the AFNOR and SEN level. And there was a problem because, in fact, there were very few representation of the farmers. And at the real beginning, there was some representative, but they had no time and no money to spend in such processes, knowing that they have a lot of different concern, not only biofuels, but lots of markets that are addressed. So you have standardization, you have a lot of different processes. So how can we go ahead to improve collaboration between all stakeholders?
Well, I can tell you yesterday we had a telephone conference between 10 parties to create a consortium to do a Horizon 2020 project which is inclusive regarding what you said. And it includes some of the certification bodies, it includes some of the people who do standardization, but also not only the people who do, let's say, the bureaucratic way, but also the citizens organization for standardization and a few other stakeholders. Wish us luck. If we succeed to get this going, then we will actually hit on that. But on a practical way, I would say the issue of trust and understanding and permeability is core. So I'm in the fortunate position to know a lot of people because I'm rather old nowadays. But some of the young people have access across the borders because they have been traveling around, they have been part of the Erasmus program and so forth, and they maintain this contact. So the most important thing is to tunnel through, to avoid the traps of the current kind of system and to find new ways. And that's where all of you can be creative. So if you are here and you're saying you have a problem, or you have perceived a problem, you seek allies. You know, I think that's what we have to do, to go together. And that's basically including different avenues, and we may want to go back sometime and leave some behind and so forth. But actually the idea is to be really, to listen to the others and try to understand. And there is an immense capacity, that's what I discovered, at least in my personal network, we have an immense capacity to deliver quickly. The discussion between the IEA Bioenergy and the GBEP people had spin-offs in the last 10 years, which eased better decision-making in other parts of the international governance game than we expected. But it helped, because it created a core of trust, and along that, you can build on. And again, there's nothing arguing against publishing and academic tracks and so forth. That's all needed. But it's not good enough to deliver on the challenge.
Hello, I'm PhD student with Lori Sunghae, and I have a question about, like, for example, yesterday we talked about like the coal mining. If it should die, how the government or the economy should support them to transition into different kind of job? But also, like in bioeconomy, if we say that the first generation, this kind of farming for biofuel is not sustainable, how do we like nudge them to transition into more sustainable farming? And also another question is that, like, how much do you think is our consumption behavior can be an influence to this whole bioeconomy other than the governance, like people choosing to maybe fly less or eat less meat and or drive on biofuel and so on, even though it's more expensive?
Well, that was a whole research program you outlined. On the level of consumption, I would say this is the hardest part. Level of consumption means in our societies, here in Western Europe, we are far, far above the basic needs logic, right? That's the needs, to describe the needs is comparatively easy, but above that level, it's very hard to say, do you travel 10,000 miles or 100,000 miles or 1,000,000 miles, right? That actually, you may have to travel 1,000 per year, but up there, and Gandhi has a nice saying, Earth offers enough for everyone, but not for everyone's greed. Yeah? So that's something which tells you there's a philosophical component to it and so forth. So I say looking into the supply side or demand side constrictions is something we don't know much about, other than economic instruments and having targets we want to meet and then we adjust. But let's explore, I would say. On the side, how do we do this transition? Well, the first thing, I guess, is already that we accept that a transition is needed. So it's that we cannot continue. That's the first thing. And we have targets where we aim to go. So the transition pathway is not a given. So we have to start the journey and discover it. I know it sounds very strange, but imagine the pathway we have in Germany where we spend 40 billion euros for 3 small regions on getting out of lignite production. 25,000 people having jobs there over a period of about 20 years. That's not a recipe for the rest of the world, right? That's not a recipe for Greece, that's not a recipe for the Czech Republic, and so forth. And clearly not for Ireland and other places. So they must come up with their own solution, but we can talk about it, and that's what we do. We have inter-regional exchanges, and that people from the Czech Republic, from Poland, from Estonia, and the people in the eastern part of Germany and the western part of Germany where we have lignite start to share their experience. And the bioeconomy is in 2 of these 3 regions a significant component. Not in a sense that they will have a one-to-one replacement of lignite, that won't work, but in terms of interesting business opportunities and creating new jobs and so forth. And I think that's something we're gonna see more and more. And hopefully we can bring in the food system logic. I was very happy, the previous speaker, making this very clear signal that there is diversity on this planet. And I think that's something we have to acknowledge. A global model of transition will not work. We have to adjust to the circumstances and to the real players, but to exchange experience and hopefully form alliance, something I think I don't say often enough.
Ludovic Montastruc from Toulouse. Thank you very much for a very nice presentation. I agree about your conclusion. And I would like to have some question, because during your talk you don't speak about technical and ecosystem services. And what do you think about this kind of services in bioeconomy in order to promote this kind of bioeconomy?
Well, I wasn't asked to give a full-length appreciation of all the dimensions, but I try to capture that there are goals and constraints, and there are some demand sectors and so forth, and the ecosystem service or the natural capital logic is something I strongly recommend as a perspective when we talk about the bioeconomy. But unfortunately, it's not good enough to really guide us in a practical sense. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I'm an experimental physicist. I'm absolutely in favor of experiments, of gaining, evidence, and then make a decision. Open up the opportunities. So I would not rule out that 10 years from now we may have a nature capital-based European investment bank. I don't rule out the option. I don't say it's probable. Yeah? Or that the ecosystem services would be part of the payment and the classical economy we have, unless a carbon price, I think that's on the horizon, but a carbon price is a really small component of what we're talking about, right? So I think we must see that as an issue. Is it a research and academic endeavor? I'm much in favor of that. And are there opportunities to actually implement it in a practical sense into a bioeconomy journey? And there I would say, at least as a generic principle, no. But in some cases, nature is, you're living in France, we're here in France, right? And you are already in France, have a lot of ecosystem services embedded in your own economy, deeply. if you look into all the fragrances you create, all the herbs, all the medical plants you extract from nature, it's not that we have industry built to do that. We just make use of it. And there are many other places where we do that, and I think that's something where we have to improve our learning and our communication to make people aware. But again, as a guiding principle for the governance, I would question that it's already good enough and ripe enough to deliver on that.
Yes, Julian Carré from Toulouse. At the end of your speech and during your speech, you raised the question of the level of consumption, which has already been said previously. And at the same time, at the beginning of your speech, you rely on the SDGs, where the number 8 is constant economic growth. And so I would like to know your opinion about that. Is there a contradiction between what you say about the level of consumption and the SDG number 8? From your point of view?
To give you the quick answer, the GDP and the orientation on economic markers and identifiers, like income and so forth, will remain for those who have it. Right? So we will not see a quick transition away from GDP from the governments we have. But there are a lot of governments, a lot of countries, and I would say the majority of people on this planet actually don't have the luxury to talk about that. For them, it's a very different situation. So that's why I'm arguing, when we have a view of the planet and of the bioeconomy and the living of people, the livelihood of people, we should not have just one view, right? And that is one view, and it's relevant for a lot of our, in the sense of European neighbors, yes. The growth is something, as a physicist, I would answer, if you have a nonlinear system, doing that, it can also grow back. There is a debate about degrowth, and there is a debate about transition and shifting and so forth. So growth, just as an overall total, is something which will never work if you have a system which is finite. But if you say you shift between, you can have growth here and degrowth there, why not? And the other is the debate we had in the 80s about qualitative growth, right? That there is some growth you actually want. And I'm one of the authors of an article that we say we want to have more land use changes because the current land use is actually not sustainable, so we want to change that. That doesn't mean we want to have change everywhere, right? I think we have to really be cautious about a generic concept like growth and the translation into real life. I want that some industries in the country where I live actually grow, and others should diminish and wither. And the GDP impact on that may be actually positive, but I don't care. Yes?
It was more like a comment or to interact in relation with the previous question and that one. I think that, I mean, we're about to live some kind of revolution in agriculture and in the carbon economy maybe, because there are some. There is something that is lacking now. It's some kind of tool that would allow us to guide the practices, the change of the practices to have some good analysis of the current situation and that tool that would allow us to see what can we change and in an effective way, both on the biophysical aspect like ecosystem services, crop yield, carbon storage, but also on economical aspects. And the revolution I'm thinking about is linking some new technologies like the remote sensing and agriculture. I mean, now the European Commission is about to change the way they pay the farmers. There is the second pillar of the CAP policy. There is a lot of money there, but they just don't know exactly how they will spend this money, because they need to monitor what are the current agricultural practices, and so far we didn't have that tool. And with remote sensing now, we will be able to see things, we'll be able to quantify some of the ecosystem benefits like carbon storage, and that's one of the things we are working on. And I think that once we get this tool, that will change a lot. That will change a lot of things for the farmers and for the society, because it will allow the farmer to receive some money from both the private and public sector, so that will fasten the ecological transition towards more sustainable agriculture. And well, just to say that, and also the private sector is expecting such a tool, because there are some companies who want to compensate their emissions, but they cannot do it now because there is no tool to quantify what is the amount of carbon that is stored by this or that farmer on that plot that year. And we're about to change that. And I think that will be a real revolution in the carbon economy and in agriculture in particular. So do you have, what's your, what do you think about that? Do you agree, or?
I'm trying to sort it out. First of all, you're absolutely right. I wouldn't call it a revolution, but there's innovation, okay? And to what extent that revolution lies, let's see. The thing I completely disagree with you is that we have a carbon economy. We don't. That's one of our major obstacles. We don't have a carbon economy. Outside of the European emission trading system, there is no carbon economy at all, right? It's voluntary markets. They're extremely volatile and so forth. They don't deliver. So I think if we're not good enough in our talk, we do so as it is wishful thinking. You know, we say, oh, we already have a carbon economy. No, we don't. Right? If we would have, in a scenario world, I'm completely with you. And there are far more components I would add to it. We are looking into, in our work, into a small work stream where we call citizen science. So it's the opposite to remote sensing. It's participatory sensing, right? It's not a satellite flying around and big data. It's something we interact. And there is an Indonesian case we heard before about oil palm as one of the problems. And colleagues from YASA have worked with colleagues in Indonesia on an interactive web application on their mobile phones to actually track what happens in the real world in real time in an Indonesian setting. I would not call yet that a revolution, because there are massive forces in Indonesia who, even with that evidence, they would still ignore it. And we know some countries are doing quite good in ignoring evidence. But it's an opportunity to engage with people, to reach out, and also talking about degradation, you know, what's actually happening, and do you improve? But you said something which is, in my point of view, a revolution in thinking. And that is practices. And it was mentioned before regarding the food systems. One thing is to look to scientific evidence, what's happening on the soil, what is the degradation rate, what is the soil organic carbon content, and so forth. The other is to look to what's happening on that soil. And that's far easier to observe and far easier to stimulate. And I think that's something we're going to see more also in the European agricultural policy, instead of saying, oh, please measure to what extent have your land use change from the one to the other. Promote and evidence that you have changed your practices. That will help. I'm absolutely with you.
Okay. Yannick Malbert from Natural. It's good to talk about soil, because my question is, when you talk about biomass, for example, if you take straw from field to make bioenergy, there's a lack of nutrient and carbon that go back to the soil, because you can let straw go back to the soil, but you use it to make bioenergy. Then you have to make and build fertilizer, then make fertilizer go to the field. And have have governments and look at what is the best biomass to use, what is the biomass stocks that we can't use because it's useful at this place for other stuff.
Yeah, it's one of the constraints you mentioned when you look into straw. Clearly, we need a boundary to the extraction rate, right? On the other hand, it depends, if there is a problem at all, depends on what you do with the straw. If you burn it, if you gasify it and burn it, then all the micronutrients and the nitrogen is lost. If you do biogas and biomethane out of it, you can recycle the digestate and you can achieve, that's what we see in Italy, northern Italy, there's evidence of that. We can actually improve the soil quality while taking out some of the straw, but we're not taking out the straw, we're bringing back the components to the system. So I think there are good ways to do that, avoiding the trade-offs, and that's what I said, go for the positive ones. Try to be inclusive in terms of what you do and be aware of negative trade-offs which you should avoid. That's the way forward. So in that sense, I cannot say there is a best use for straw, but I can say there are uses in some regions with some soils which are beneficial to the soils. And those we should promote, right? But we need this comprehensive thinking about the overall trade-offs before we make a decision. And that's where the tools, we have heard about the LCA tools and so forth, are only one component. We also need to look into the land use interchanges and the biodiversity impacts and the social impacts. Don't misunderstand that. In some cases you have a wonderful solution, but the people just won't accept, so it's a no-go. Right? I think we have to be aware sustainability is not just environment.